If I were precepting you in the ICU, chances are I'm going to do something like this with you during your first couple of shifts. ABGs and how they relate to ventilator settings are super important to understand when you're in the ICU. So let's do this one together. This is a real life scenario of a patient that I took care of. The patient has a pH of 7.12. Their CO2 was 96, bicarb 31. So right off the bat, we look at the pH, high, low, or normal. We know this is low because normal pH is between 7.35 and 7.45. So a low pH means that the patient is acidotic. Now we need to figure out why. We look at the CO2. Normal CO2 is between 35 and 45, so a CO2 of 96 is very high. And we look at our bicarb. Normal bicarb is between 22 and 26, so a bicarb of 31 is also high. Now, what is making this patient acidotic? We know that elevated CO2s make a patient more acidotic, and elevated bicarbs make a patient alkalotic. So I'm sensing some compensation here. CO2 being elevated is driving that patient's pH to be acidotic, meaning that this is a respiratory acidosis. But because the bicarb is also out of range, the body is trying to compensate. However, the pH is still way out of range, and so we only have some partial compensation going on here. This is a partially compensated respiratory acidosis. So let's say your patient gets intubated, and these are the ventilator settings they end up on. FiO2 is 40%, respiratory rate's 24, tidal volume 400, and PEEP is 5. The patient is on these vent settings for a while, and then you go ahead and draw another ABG, and this is the ABG you get. pH is 7.25. Low, still acidotic. Your CO2 is 55, that's still high, so we still know there's some sort of respiratory acidosis going on here, and your bicarb still 31. This is still a partially compensated respiratory acidosis, but how can we fix this? By adjusting the ventilator settings. Or BFF when it comes to ventilators and learning ABGs is going to be understanding minute ventilation. Minute ventilation is your respiratory rate times your tidal volume. So when you have a patient with an elevated CO2, how do we make them get rid of that CO2? They have to blow it off. Well, how can we adjust a ventilator to make a patient blow off more CO2? We need to increase their minute ventilation. So in order to increase their minute ventilation, we can do one or two things. We can increase their respiratory rate and or increase their tidal volume. Now this just depends on the situation, the patient, how fast they're already breathing, how sedated they are. But if you take a look at these vent settings right here, respiratory rate of 24 times tidal volume of 400, that is going to give you a minute ventilation of 9.6 liters. So we need to make the patient breathe more than 9.6 liters in order to blow off more of that CO2. So let me know if these type of walkthroughs are helpful, and I'm happy to talk more.